PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Colter Harper, author of Jazz in the Hill.
Colter Harper is the author of Jazz in the Hill, Nightlife and Narratives of a Pittsburgh Neighborhood. When did you first learn of the history of the Hill District?
I learned of it when I was in high school. I moved to Pittsburgh this really all got started for me when I moved to Pittsburgh in 1995. And it was my introduction to Rust Belt America. So I had grown up in upstate New York and lived in Florida. And I began to move around the city and learn that Pittsburgh was just made up of all these incredibly distinct neighborhoods that had these strong identities. And the city was really still in the process of emerging from this collapse of the region's industry. So the book grew from my experience playing jazz in this event called Jazz at the Hill House. And I was a young musician interested in branching out from pop music that I had grown up with to trying to understand what it was that, say, Wes Montgomery or John Coltrane were doing. And I was informed that there was a jam session, which is a place where you would go to study this music. And so I went to this event, Jazz at the Hill House, which was a jam session that ran from 1991 to 1999 in the Kaufman Auditorium. And that auditorium is still there, but the session is long gone. So just to give you a sense of what this was like, I'm in high school. I'm told about this event, and I'm very interested to go visit there. But within a very short time of being in Pittsburgh, I'm sort of informed through media and just a general opinion that the Hill District is not a place that's welcoming or a place that you should go or a place that has anything to offer. So I was very interested to go there. And when I showed up at this event, I got a very different experience of the Hill District than was sort of the pervasive knowledge of this part of Pittsburgh. And through this jam session, it was an experience of learning not just the music, but also the incredible contributions of this community to Pittsburgh, greater Pittsburgh, and also American culture. Should I explain a little bit how the session worked? Because it's
Sure, go ahead.
It's a big part of learning how to play and improvise music such as jazz. You show up, in this case, you show up on a Sunday around 3 p.m. and it was, you're meeting with elder jazz musicians and you're working on repertoire. And this was run by a husband and wife duo who are from the Hill District, Horace and Mary Turner. Horace passed away last year at the age of 100. And around 5 p.m., this auditorium would start to fill up with audience members. And many of these people had heard incredible musicians, John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Abbey Lincoln, in clubs that were within a walking distance. And so this would have been in the 1950s and 60s. So you were performing for listeners that had a very high standard of and a very high level of knowledge of this music. And it was there that you really started to learn how this music could shape your understanding of the city, and it was a place of collective teaching and a way of listening and improvising, as well as this history of the music. So the recordings of John Coltrane and Wes Montgomery that had brought me there were sort of the impetus for seeking out this neighborhood, but it was in that space that you start to look at the repertoire and the music as a larger story about American history, and particularly history about how African Americans have faced the challenge of building community in northern cities in the 20th century, and the way that's really shaped America's cultural and political landscape.
Now you say that the book began as a social history of these jazz clubs, and you talk in the book about it's not just a history of the music, but it's a history of the community and how these clubs were hubs of community activity. What led you into these clubs as a researcher?
It's where you would learn the music. I don't believe you can really learn how to play jazz just by listening to recordings. It's about understanding its connection beyond just making music and the conversations that artists are having with one another, but also their relationship to labor movements and businesses and entrepreneurial developments and the changing landscape of the city. So being in the clubs is a place where you have those kind of conversations that you wouldn't have if you're just kind of listening to the music and hearing the music.
Now, let's go into some of those clubs. Take us back to the 1920s. Prohibition is going on. You have clubs like the Leader House and Collins Inn. What would they have been like?
So this is the part of the story which was challenging for me because obviously I wasn't around in the 1920s to go to these venues. I did get the opportunity to play at the Crawford Grill in the late 90s and early 2000s. But tracing that history of that back to the 20s, what were the first jazz clubs in Pittsburgh? And I give these couple examples of the Leader House and the Paramount Club. And it's the first thing that really struck me about these venues were that they were places in a rapidly changing community. So Pittsburgh 100 years ago was, I think, one of the top 10 cities in terms of population size. I think probably number 9, around 600,000 people living here. And there was populations from Europe. There was a rapidly increasing population of migrant workers from American South and Midwest. So the city was just a booming center of culture and industry. And the Hill District was a place where you had Italian and Polish and Lebanese and Jewish populations and communities with a smaller African-American population, which traced its history back to the 19th century, mixing also with this rapidly growing African-American community from the American South. So there was just a lot happening. And these early jazz clubs were created by entrepreneurs that were supporting the performance of, this emerging music of what we call jazz now, which is really kind of developing in the early 1920s into this kind of improvised art form that we appreciate today. And these spaces were small. They were not big venues. They could accommodate maybe 40 or 50 people. And they were featuring vocalists and musicians from all over the country that were coming through Pittsburgh. They were a place where visiting touring artists would come to hear local performers. And there were also places where young musicians would learn. So there's famous stories about pianist Earl Hines as a teenager going into one of these clubs and hearing a pianist from the West, Midwest, playing a style of music he'd never heard before. He was classically trained as he came up, and it just sort of turned on the light for him, and it changed his whole sort of career path to move into this kind of music. And then when he decided to go to Chicago, he had a connection through the Collins Inn, through Harry Collins, and made those connections to basically launch his career outside of Pittsburgh. But the thing that was really striking me is that this term black and tan kept showing up in the media. And by media, I mean newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Pittsburgh Post. And why are these early jazz clubs being called black and tan cabarets? They're not called jazz clubs. They're not called nightclubs necessarily. The term that was used most often was black and tan cabaret. And I kept seeing this as you read thousands of newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s, as you're trying to get a sense for this history. You see these terms kind of come into use and fall out of use. And so one of my focus was just to try to understand what this term meant, black and tan. And it has its roots actually in the American Reconstruction era. It was a term that grew out of this period in which the Civil War had come to an end, and it was this phrase that emerged basically after the emancipation of enslaved people and the end of the Civil War. And the Confederate South had been defeated and occupied by Union Army, and new state constitutions had been drafted that were creating paths for African Americans to vote and serve in government. And these constitutions and coalitions of Black and white politicians were denigrated as quote unquote Black and tan by Southern Democrats at that time. And it appears by the 1900s, this term Black and tan became kind of more widely used to refer to any kind of public gatherings where there was interracial socializing, or whether it be social or political. And then by the 20s, the term had really become something that became closely associated with specifically nightclubs and venues, because this was a point at which Northern American cities were quickly changing in terms of their demographic makeup, and they were becoming large African American communities. And so as jazz clubs were created, you had spaces of interracial socializing that were then targeted by local authorities to basically try to enforce some kind of color line or, segregated policy within the North. And this gets tied up with the very complex politics and legal background of the Prohibition and enforcing the ban on liquor, which we know didn't work, but it was in many ways provided kind of the legal basis for clamping down on clubs that were seen as that the local authorities wanted to put pressure on, because they were allowing a certain kind of socializing in a city that was challenging to the white supremacist narrative and segregation.
Now, you mentioned the Pittsburgh Courier, and a couple of the columnists there. John Clark had a column called Wiley Avenue, and Chester Washington had one called Walking Up Wiley. How did they portray these clubs? How did they create a narrative about what these clubs were about?
That's such an important part of this, and that's really where the story starts for me, because I, as a teenager, came to Pittsburgh. I don't remember how I was fed the narrative that the Hill District was a dangerous place or a place that didn't have anything to offer, but I just sort of absorbed that from my environment, and then I had to challenge that by physically going there and being involved with community activities. And so this power of narrative is really a part of this story, and it's going back 100 years, easily 150 years, with the founding of Pittsburgh Courier and other African-American owned newspapers. These newspapers were not only telling the stories of people in these communities, but they were also creating counter narratives. So that's part of why I titled the book, the subtitle is Nightlife and Narratives of a Pittsburgh Neighborhood, because the Courier, through these columns, were giving an image of these clubs that gave them like a kind of focused in on individuals that were performing there, how they were important and intertwined with the cultural and political landscape of the neighborhood, whereas columns maybe like Danvers' column, Pittsburgh Est, in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette might sort of speak about these clubs as this sort of stereotypical, smoky, dangerous places where you have to check your weapon at the door. There was this sort of very like stereotypical narratives that were presented of these clubs in other press, and then the Courier would talk more about specific individuals and their relationship to one another, and that was very important to creating this sense of jazz clubs as not just places of entertainment, but places that are intertwined into a community.
Now, these clubs feature local musicians, but also touring musicians. What was the relationship like between the local musicians and touring musicians, and how did that facilitate the spread of ideas about music?
I think that relationship is so important to the history of jazz, because as anybody who knows about Pittsburgh music history knows that the city has fostered the early careers, or sort of supported the early careers of some of the greatest American musicians: Ahmad Jamal, Earl Garner, Earl Hines, Billy Eckstine, Ray Brown, George Benson. I'm just kind of Mary Lou Williams. Like, you can go down this truly incredible list of musicians that were kind of got their start in this city. But the interesting part of that story, Billy Strayhorn, is that these people had to leave Pittsburgh in order to build that international recognition. So there's a tension there between Pittsburgh being a vibrant cultural center for music, but also not being a center for recording, or center for things that can really sustain an international career like Chicago or New York. And so the book that I wrote was focusing on the musicians that stayed, those musicians that we don't really have as household names, but that supported a local community and made it a welcoming place for people to return to, and for touring artists to interface with local musicians. So if Duke Ellington played in Pittsburgh, he might go after his performance downtown to have dinner at the Crawford Grill and be hosted there. And from there, he might hear local musicians, or might interact with local musicians. And there's a famous story about Billy Strayhorn meeting Duke Ellington in Pittsburgh, and that leading to one of the greatest creative collaborations of the 20th century, Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington. And that's just kind of one example of how you have local scenes. You have musicians that spent their whole careers here, but then you had younger musicians that were meeting touring bands and making that jump to take their career onto a national stage. And it's, it's not for everybody to live the life of a touring musician. It's not an easy thing. So it was up to individuals to decide where they were going to build their careers, and that interface of local and touring musicians really opened up the opportunities for that to be a possibility.
Now, one of the key clubs during some of this period was the Hurricane Bar and Grill, and one of the figures that you talk about in the book associated with that was Bertie Dunlop. Who was she, and what was her impact on this community?
So we're jumping ahead a little bit here. So the book really focuses on from 1920 to 1970 approximately. So, and it's broken into three broad parts. So the first part's really just about the 1920s. And then the second part focuses on the urban redevelopment era of the 1950s and the emergence of Crawford Grill and the Hurricane Bar. So you mentioned the Hurricane Bar is this venue that ran, I think, from 1954 until 1971, if the dates are approximately around that time. And it was run by Anna Simmons Dunlap. Her nickname was Birdie. And she co-owned it with her husband, but she was really the individual who shaped not only just who was hired in terms of the musicians, but also how the club was laid out. She had seen a club she really enjoyed where the stage was about 5 feet off the floor. And this is not a big space. So some of the photos by Teenie Harris, which really give you a sense of how this stage brought the band up high enough so everybody in the venue could see the band, and the band could also have a direct line of sight to everybody in the band. So she really believed in creating an environment where music was an interactive and spiritually and emotionally and creatively rejuvenating experience. And she wanted there to be very close-knit listeners in proximity to the musicians, and to create really a special place for mainly jazz organ players. And when she first opened this, she hired Ruby Young, who was a Pittsburgh pianist and organist who was also involved with the union. And she had a trio, and they were playing kind of more background music. But it wasn't long before she started to hire Jimmy Smith, who is one of the great jazz organists, the greatest jazz organist easily. Most people acknowledge that, who played with such fire and incredible energy, and he would just fill this club up with this the sound, it would spill through the walls out into the streets. You could hear it out there. So it really became a place that was known for people, musicians and artists pushing kind of the limits of what this instrument could do, the jazz Hammond organ. And there was a lot of different types of acts that would come through there, R&B acts and blues singers, but there was always this kind of consistent sound of the jazz organ, which I don't know exactly why she settled on that. Part of my thought was that she saw an opportunity to create an alternative listening space to the Crawford Grill, which tended to focus more on traditional jazz ensembles, quintets and quartets without jazz organs. So she was a very savvy business person. So I imagine maybe she thought, okay, this is our identity. This is kind of the identity of this place, is to create a house of organs. And she did very well by it.
You mentioned in the book a word, mazeways. Talk about the concept of mazeways and how does that apply to the Hill District?
So that's a term created by a psychologist, Mindy Fololove, or I'm not sure if she actually termed it, but it's a term that's been used in psychology and cultural geography to explain those paths that we take every day through a city. So most of our lives are shaped by our home life, our work life, and our leisure life. And moving between those different spaces creates our mazeways. And our mazeways are really a way that's connected to how we understand places in which we live and the emotional connections that we have to places. So if you imagine your daily routine of getting up and going out and getting coffee or driving to work or walking to work, and then at night, if you're going to have dinner or a drink with some friends or meet with them, these are all these little paths that kind of build our relationship to a place. And in the Hill District from 1951 to the early 1960s, there was an incredible disruption in terms of the city-led redevelopment of the Lower Hill, which cleared 105 acres of residential and businesses in order to build the civic arena. And so there was this great disruption to this kind of pathways that people were taking in their daily lives. And what I try to do in this section of the book is to connect this modernization of the city led by David Lawrence and this corporate leaders, Richard King Mellon, so there's this vision of what the modern city should be, which is led very much by a top-down corporatist vision of the city. And then I try to compare that to the sort of modernist vision of the city led by people like Bertie Dunlap. And they were creating spaces that were allowing for creative ideas about what modernity was, and also what a business could do in terms of facilitating a truly interracial existence within a segregated city in the height of the civil rights era. So mazeways connect to this idea of place and the values that we have to place and how those can be disrupted by urban redevelopment projects.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, you mentioned Teenie Harris and his photographs are throughout the book. How did he depict these jazz clubs? What do you learn from them by looking at his photographs?
They're an infinitely there's just so much information to draw from his images. There's over 80,000 large format negatives that have been digitized, or at least between 75,000 and 80,000. that are held by the Carnegie Museum of Art. So imagine this is one of the largest visual archives of a African-American community in the United States, if not the largest. And it covers every aspect of life from the late 30s through the late 60s. So it could be portraits, it could be political events, it could be public parades, it could be, and there's so much of it that focuses on music venues, which as a historian is an incredible resource, because when I started this work, I just saw how incredibly vibrant and obviously invested people were in these spaces through the photos. And then as I brought those photos to people that were in the photos, for example, older musicians that were active in the 50s, but then looking at photos of themselves, 50 years later, the images brought all of these memories back and were allowed us to have conversations that wouldn't have been possible without the images, because our memory fades. It's hard for us to recall details, but the photos allow us to focus in on all these incredible details of spatial arrangement of the venues, who went there, how did people dress, what was the repertoire, what was your approach to, how many gigs a week did you play? Just all these kind of ins and outs of what made the scene functioning and like this living tradition. But your question was about Teenie Harris and how he depicted the clubs. He was someone that everyone knew. I would say most of the people that were being photographed understood who Teenie Harris was as a photographer who had his own studio and also worked for the Courier. So there was no confusion about why he might be taking a photo, and there was a trust in why he might be taking a photo. Photos can be sometimes people don't want to be photographed, but often when Teenie Harris is taking a photo, you'll see people also looking back at him. So he becomes, in a way, a subject of the photo as well. He's part of the community that he's photographing, and he understands the people as individuals that he's photographing, but he's also creating this incredible index of individual moments that are not iconic. They're not images that, like a lot of these photos of jazz in the mid 20th century, where you see the sort of highly stylized photograph of Dexter Gordon by Herman Leonard, or these incredible, like, beautiful images, but they sort of take the individual and make them into this larger, grander narrative. Teenie Harris's photos were so good at showing musicians as part of a specific moment in a relationship of a community dynamics, and also the intersection of entrepreneurs and club owners and audience members and media personnel. They're all part of this incredibly complex and open-ended story about what this community was. So his photos, for me, have been incredibly important for trying to understand this history, and they remain to be this resource for far more studies to come. So it's an incredible collection. And I should also mention that the Carnegie Museum of Art recently opened their permanent installation featuring his photos and a reading area. So if you go to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, you'll see a specific gallery now dedicated to his photography.
Now, if we go back to the early decades of this period that you cover, one of the key figures is Gus Greenlee. Who is he, and what impact did he have on this club culture?
It's amazing to see certain individuals just that influence such a wide range of things in an area. And historian Rob Bruck has done a great, incredible job studying his influence on baseball specifically, so Sandlot seasons. And journalist Mark Whitaker has also written an incredible book, Smoketown, and that touches a bit on his story. So he's this sort of larger than life figure that moved to Pittsburgh sometime around World War II. And the story of him is that he he was moving bootleg liquor around the city in a taxi cab, but there's a lot of mystery about his early life, and he's also someone who's uh, given the credit for popularizing the numbers business in the Western Pennsylvania. So this would have been before lotteries were kind of state sponsored. This was sort of an informal street lottery. And so this was something that generated an immense amounts of wealth. And he was buying some of these buildings in the mid 20s to have these venues, which were not inexpensive by any standard. So he was making a lot of money, and he was able to invest it in buying property, running music venues, and also supporting local political causes, but then very involved in the sports world, baseball and boxing. So he was somebody who had his hands in a lot of different areas. And the Crawford Grill #1 grew out of his experiences with the Paramount Club in the 20s during the Black and Tan era. And then after Prohibition ended, he opened the Crawford Grill #1. And this became a very important meeting place for people in the sports world and the political world. And it wasn't necessarily, it had music, but it wasn't necessarily known as a primarily a live music venue. And it wasn't until the Crawford Grill #2 opened, which he opened with Joe Robinson, and that was outside of the redevelopment era, that club became really one of the most longest running and most kind of revered jazz clubs. So he was somebody who had access to a lot of capital, and then kind of put it out in different ways that really impacted the development of the scene. For example, he owned the building that the Musicians Union Local 471 had their offices in Lower Hill. So it's not clear, but it seems like he kind of made that space available to them to support the unionized musicians union, which didn't have a lot of resources. That might be just one example of how he was kind of shaping this musical landscape. And he's not a musician himself, but obviously somebody who appreciated it.
How did these clubs offer opportunities for women as singers and musicians to kind of move beyond the traditional role of women in, say, the 1920s and 30s?
20s and 30s specifically, it was, when we're talking about the 20s, you're definitely thinking of this era where we have this these emergence of what are called the classic blues singers, Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and these incredible personalities and larger than life figures who were singing without amplification. I mean, that's also incredible to think about, being in a stage with an audience of 300 people. This is before microphones and speakers are really widely used. So you really had to have this ability to project through an acoustic space and project your personality through that. And this is a time when there's a lot of different troupes, like they could be like groups of artists and actors and musicians traveling around the United States and performing in these, what was called the TOBA, like the Theater Owner Booking Association, which were primarily booking African-American artists in these larger theaters. So imagine one of these troupes might show up and perform in a TOBA venue in the Hill District, but you might have some time off. So some of those artists, the singers or dancers from the chorus line, might then get a few weeks to perform in a local smaller cabaret, what were called these Black and Tan cabarets, and have these opportunities to play in duos and trios to kind of expand their repertoire and expand just basically piece together a life as a touring musician, which is extremely challenging. So the smaller clubs kind of gave a little bit of a platform for for women performers, vocalists. I mean, we could jump ahead here to Birdie's Hurricane, where she really featured a remarkable number of female artists who were not just vocalists, but an incredible number of jazz organists that were there featured as the primary organists that were leading their groups, and also great drummers like Paula Roberts. And so in jazz, traditional jazz history, women are generally relegated to this narrative of being only vocalists. But if you look at a lot of these clubs, especially the Hurricane, you see how incredibly important they were as instrumentalists, and also labor union organizers and entrepreneurs in the case of Bernie Dunlap.
They mentioned labor, the local musicians union, Local 471, played a significant role on the Hill in the Hill District at this time, and they had the Musicians Club there. To talk about the significance of that union and that club for them.
Well, for those that don't know, the American Federation of Musicians was a national union, and just like the steelworkers, and their headquarters were in New York. And they would have locals in each city that would be set up in order to organize the musicians of that region. They would, collect dues, and they would basically be these kind of regional representatives of the American Federation of Musicians, the AFM. But in most cities, the locals were segregated. So you would have a white local established, and then you would see Black musicians wanting to organize and not be welcomed by the white local. And so they would set up their own locals with their own presidents and boards and members. And what's remarkable about these Black locals is that they didn't consider themselves segregated. They would welcome white members into their membership. So they were actually imagining and dismantling this segregated system of performance within their own abilities, even before the civil rights era. And so you had several of these locals which were actually quite powerful in Chicago, Philadelphia. Pittsburgh was, I would say, mid-sized in terms of like the number of members they had, but they would collect dues, and they would, you had to be a union member in order to perform. There's stories of union officers going around and checking people's cards at gigs and seeing if your dues are up. That's just something that musicians can't really imagine nowadays. Like the idea that I'm a performing musician if I go to a jazz club like Con Alma in Pittsburgh. I can't imagine, a union officer walking up to me in the middle of my gig and asking me to show me, to show my card to show that I've bought into this collectivity and this statement of solidarity around defending workers' rights. But that's kind of how it was in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. So people were very invested in being union members, and Local 471, which is the African-American local of Pittsburgh, had some leaders in the late 50s and early 60s that were really challenging this. It was a paradox. I call it a bit of a paradox because they were challenging the limitations that were forced on them by white racial segregation and white supremacy, and basically this isolation of them to certain regions. So they wanted to be able to access other venues rightfully, and but at the same time they didn't want to sacrifice all of the hard work they had done over the past 40 years in terms of building collectivity and having their own representation to merge with Local 60. And when that merger was forced in 1965 following the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we saw in every case more than 40 different mergers around the United States. We saw in most cases when these unions merged, the former Black members of those individual unions did not get representation in this new merged union because they didn't have enough voting power. And so this was one of the great paradoxes of the civil rights law of 1965, is that you see a lot of removal of African-American musicians from positions of administration and representation, and then the American Federation of Musicians, which led many of them to leave the union. And I go into some detail with the court case that was brought up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the only city that had a court case addressing this merger and the perpetuation of discrimination that was created through that merger process.
Now, they also had the Musicians Club, which people would go to and experiment and get to know each other. Talk about this club, and what was the significance for the community at that time?
So the Musicians Club was a building that had previously been a venue, and I have some maps in the book that show these individual addresses that became various locations. So this had been a black and tan club in the 1920s, and it was a building owned by Gus Greenlee. So by the late 1940s, it had become the offices of Local 471, but they were also on the second floor holding concerts there. And it was just kind of like one of these famous places to go hear Ahmad Jamal or Earl Garner in a very, small, intimate place, but hearing some of these incredible musicians playing alongside musicians that might stop by for a jam session after playing at a theater downtown or something like that. So it was just a place that had an incredible reputation for hearing really great music. And part of this story was that, when we're looking at these Teenie Harris photos, they were not unlabeled. So I would recognize certain rooms over and over again. And I'd be like, I'm trying to figure out what this place was in this photograph. And one day I was meeting with Thaddeus Mosley, the incredible sculptor in Pittsburgh, who was a very active jazz fan in the 40s and 50s. And I saw a photo that I recognized, of Teenie Harris photo hanging in his house. And I recognized that location as the same place as this other location I'd been looking at. And I said, Thad, can you tell me where this was? And he was like, oh, of course, that's the old Musicians Union, Musicians Club and Union. And it just connected all these other photos of this location of the Musicians Club to one another. And we were able to see all these incredible local and touring artists that had convened there, because it was a point at which the AFM was representing musicians, a place where you would go rehearse, like Walt Harper, the pianist of Pittsburgh, would rehearse his band there, and then young musicians would go there to study. And late at night, people would show up. They would be honorary members, so you would have like a little card. So even if you weren't a musician, you could go there and stay until 3 or 4 in the morning hearing music. And because it wasn't actually a business, it was a social club. So it kind of subvert some of these laws in terms of when you were supposed to close and things like that.
Now, after World War II, as we move into the second period that you cover in your book, jazz begins to change too. You see the emergence of bebop. And what was different about that from what came before, and how did that change the culture of the clubs?
I think when we think about jazz, and definitely in the universities when it's taught, we tend to think of this quote unquote golden era from 1954 to about 1965, which are it's not a long period of time. It's about a decade where artists are making these statements about, and they're creating and codifying modern jazz. Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and being the kind of like two primary examples that are held up of that time period, that are really like creating the language of modern jazz based on what Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk and people had been doing previously, and as well through that time. So the clubs of the Hurricane and the Crawford Grill are excellent examples of spaces that developed alongside the emergence of modern jazz. And modern jazz was a music that was really pushing the language, harmonic, melodic, rhythmic language of the music beyond it just being something that was dance music primarily. These were spaces that you were not dancing in. You might move, you might sway a little bit, but it was a place you were meant to really listen and and understand what these artists were doing in terms of pushing the language of improvisation. So I think that shift, and the clubs really show the importance of proximity and eyesight, and also just an interactive listening space. Nowadays, if you go to hear jazz, you're usually sitting in a hall and you're sitting quietly and you'll clap after solos and you clap to the end of songs. But imagine you're there with a drink, you're moving around. And I did a lot of interviews where people would talk about a band playing that would initiate a conversation with the listeners. If they thought they were maybe losing their attention, a musician and an instrumentalist might play something to try to grab the attention of someone in the audience that was talking, and then that person might stop talking to someone else, focus their attention on the stage, and have sort of an interaction that would shape the music. And that's really one of the key features that made this environment so special for the development of this music into really this artistic form that is still what is taught in universities now in terms of the language of it.
Now you also talk about Charles Mingus and about his engagement with city soundscapes in his music. How did he interact with the sounds of the city?
Mingus was, he was an incredible composer, but he was someone who was really dealing with the music on a conceptual level. So there's a famous version you should listen. If you haven't heard this version of Foggy Day by Mingus, it's an incredible version because it plays the song, but it creates this soundscape of the city, honking horns and sounds of like moving through the streets and being near, say, like a shipping port or something like that. So he wants to really create actually jarring songs in the midst of trying to play the song. It's almost like you imagined a band on a bus moving through San Francisco as they're like getting jostled around and playing this in the midst of this city sounds. So I thought that was an important song to draw on, because I was trying to connect the experience of listeners in these clubs to the experiences of these listeners in the city of Pittsburgh and moving around the city, and also observing the rapid changes that were happening to their cities, and thinking about the music as something that was very much connected to the sounds of the cities and the ideas that we have of those sounds. Like, what does the sound of construction in 1955 represent to Hill District representatives? Is this the sound of modernity, or is this the sound of erasure? And how is that sound of modernity compared to, say, the sound of modernity that is presented by Charles Mingus and his music? So I'm very interested in that, the kind of layerings of sounds and the associations that we have with them.
So I want to move forward a little bit up to, say, maybe the late 1960s into the 1970s with these clubs. You mentioned that Nathan Davis founded a jazz program at the University of Pittsburgh. So jazz changes, the communities begin to change. What's going on during that period of time?
So, well, the main thing that happened in 1968 on April 4th was that Martin Luther King was assassinated, which was this truly devastating moment in American history that had very immediate impacts on many parts of American cities. Hill District was one of those places that was impacted by social unrest. Much of its economic infrastructure was destroyed after 1968, and the neighborhood is still emerging from that unrest. Just example, I think it didn't have a grocery store until recently. We're talking almost 60 years. So that's a major moment that kind of breaks the Hill District's past from its future. It's a moment at which a lot of people from outside of the Hill District no longer feel they are welcomed or interested in going to the music venues, which puts pressure on the club owners, and it basically kind of draw a lot of people moving out of the Hill District. So the last part of the book that after I'm writing about labor and about the redevelopment, I tried to tie together this post-1968 moment where jazz is sort of fading as the main popular music, and also jazz clubs in the Hill are no longer becoming destination points, but rather jazz is something that's diffusing out into institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, downtown clubs such as Harper's Attic or the Encore and the Shady Side. And then as we move ahead into the 90s and 2000s, looking at how other institutions have created spaces for jazz, like the Afro-American Music Institute, which is a teaching school and a venue run by Pam and James, Dr. James Johnson, and now City of Asylum, on Alma, Manchester Carpenskill. So I try to look at the ways that this tradition of jazz has kind of moved into different areas and dealt with those memories in various ways.
What would you like people to take away from this book?
I think the main takeaway from this book is that if we're listening to jazz, we really have to remember it as a community process. And these communities, the memory of these communities and the history that they've given us are also informing how we move ahead in developing our cities. So these jazz clubs are far more than just places where musicians worked, but they were places that really shaped people's relationship to the city, and also our ideas about the cities that we live in and the way that we can live in an American city. So trying to expand out that idea of jazz as being part of a larger story about being American and being part of American cities.
Well, Colter Harper is the author of Jazz in the Hill, Nightlife and Narratives of a Pittsburgh Neighborhood. Colter, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.